J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 40 of the Standing Committee on Official Languages of the House of Commons. Today's meeting will be taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the order of the House, and members can participate in person or via Zoom. As agreed upon late in the last parliamentary session, for technical reasons we had to adjourn. And how should I put this? We had to suspend, I should put it, for technical reasons. And we'll pick up where we left off. Ms. Ashton had the floor, and she was getting ready to... Well, I won't preempt what she was about to say, but on a point of order, Mr. Chairperson. Hold on a sec, please. Yes, I just want to know, and I want you to reassure me on this note, that when you adjourn a meeting for technical reasons, that the criteria and obligations under a normal suspension would apply. No, they do not apply in this case. And I told you on Tuesday that when I adjourned the meeting, that I would continue as if we had suspended the meeting. But I'm not going to follow the standing orders, and we're not going to be starting from scratch. But since Ms. Ashton had the floor, we'll act as if we are suspended and continue on from Tuesday's meeting. Mr. Chairperson, I trust you entirely as a chairperson. Now, the standing order must apply, and as parliamentarians, we can't be lackadaisical when it comes to applying the adjournment rule and the suspension rule. What's the difference, Mr. Chairperson? How can we protect our parliamentary rights in that regard, please? Well, I can take a stab at that, but I'll allow the clerk to tack on to what I have to say, or perhaps correct me. But suspending is about stopping the clock. And the clock starts up at the next meeting. So whenever we stopped with whomever had the floor, we pick up where we left off and we have the same meeting number. That's the difference. When you adjourn, the meeting is over and you start from scratch. It's a new meeting number. But because we stopped or we adjourned for technical reasons and we didn't suspend per se, I think we're up to the sixth meeting, and of course the video that's recorded became a bit cumbersome, and there's a whole hybrid format technical issue. I think that was part of the problem, and we also changed rooms, and when you change room, well, it gets difficult from a technical standpoint, including Parlvu. So we're up to meeting 40, and we can start a new meeting today. Well, officially we adjourned and we're starting a new meeting because it was meeting 38 for quite some time. Then that caused technical problems. We adjourned for 15 minutes and we're up to meeting 39. And today is meeting 40. That's right. Spot on. And I have another question, if I may. Yes, Mr. Godin and then Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Chairperson, what's important to understand here is that as parliamentarians, my rights must be protected, and I do not want technical justifications to be bandied about as a pretext for flouting my rights. Now, Mr. Chairperson, at the end of today's meeting, it might behoove us to reach unanimous consent when it comes to a technical standpoint. And that should be part of the meeting's minutes, that unanimously it was decided upon that we would adjourn the meeting, but that the suspension procedures would apply when the next meeting starts. That's a great suggestion. Yes, I think that's what we were kind of in agreement on. And when I adjourned the meeting, that was kind of what was presupposed. We didn't vote on it. There was no unanimous consent. But what I'm saying here, well, what I'm telling you is that no one stood up against it when I proposed it. Inaudible for the interpreter. Mr. Beaulieu, on a point of order, the point of order that I raised last meeting, please, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Godin referred to the 2005 minutes when the clerk stated, and I think that there was a time allocation motion moved as part of the clause-by-clause consideration, speaking time limited to 5 minutes, but the decision was that one couldn't limit speaking time of members without unanimous consent. So we're doing indirectly what we were told we couldn't do directly, aren't we? The speaking time of members of parliament in clause-by-clause consideration is being limited. You checked on that, right? Yes, Mr. Drouin. I think that we're on the debate on the amendment, so Mr. Beaulieu's point of order has nothing to do with the amendment. On a point of order, please. Well, everyone agreed. No one was opposed. No one objected to my decision. We were going to continue the meeting as if we'd suspended. Ms. Ashton had the floor. Well, I thought points of order took precedence, says Mr. Beaulieu. Well, Mr. Godin just told us that some of our rights have to be upheld whether or not one adjourns or suspends when there are technical issues. And I have no issue with that, and I don't think anyone else does. But what you're saying, sir, is that we're out of scope here. I agree with Mr. Drouin. It's not really relevant to the amendment, your point of order. Mr. Beaulieu, now, what the clerk said, and if what the clerk said is true, the debate that we're entertaining right now is about limiting speaking time of members of parliament in clause-by-clause consideration, and also the deadline. And this is being done without unanimous consent. As a worst-case scenario, Mr. Beaulieu, could you please raise that point of order when it comes to the appropriate time, Mr. Godin's amendment on clause-by-clause consideration? I think that Ms. Ashton was about to speak. Well, that would make everything else irrelevant, wouldn't it, says Mr. Beaulieu. Well, let's do one thing at a time. Ms. Ashton is going to move a sub-amendment to Mr. Godin's amendment. And what you're referring to comes a bit later in the motion, what you're alleging. At the last meeting, you said that we were in compliance with the standing orders. Well, I'll allow the clerk to give us an update on that in due course because her office researched the matter, and that's doable. I'm sorry, I don't want this to drag on through to Christmas, but you're going to give Ms. Ashton the floor. And one suspects that she's going to move a sub-amendment. But could you tell me where we're at currently? We had the Beaulieu sub-amendment. We had the Godin amendments. There are 4 of them. Then there's Mr. Serre's motion. I'd just like to get a sense of where we're at here so we're on the same page. We're up to your amendments, Mr. Godin, but we haven't voted on them yet, have we? No, that's correct. Okay, I recognise Ms. Ashton. The floor is yours, Ms. Ashton.
Merci, alors.
Thank you very much. Well, in the spirit of collaboration, and we can't hear Ms. Ashton very clearly on a point of order. We can't hear her very well from the room, says the chairperson. Can you hear me a bit better? Says Ms. Ashton. Is your headset setting correct, Ms. Ashton? Now we can hear you. That's perfect. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Loud and clear. Okie doke. Well, as I was saying, in the spirit of collaboration, and so we can move forward and do what needs to be done with a view to enhancing the bill that we're seized with. And we want this to be done efficiently and effectively. And therefore, I would like to move a number of amendments. I know that the focus is on the first of my amendments. It's at point 1, the Minister of Official Languages, the Chair of the Treasury Board, the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees, as well as their officials, be invited to appear for 1 hour per minister per meeting at the latest Thursday, December 1st, 2022. And, of course, we'd like to have ministers appear for at least 2 hours, but I think a compromise is required here. we want to make sure that we make headway and improve this piece of legislation and give francophones throughout Canada the opportunity to have their rights upheld. Now, thank you, Ms. Ashton. Is everything clear to everyone before I hand you the floor, Mr. Beaulieu? This is a sub-amendment to Mr. Godin's amendment. Is Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment clear? Well, what I'd like to know, says Mr. Beaulieu, is the 2-hour time slot is going to be substituted with a 1-hour time slot per individual meeting. There'll be one minister per meeting, and it'll be by the 1st of December rather than 24th of November. Well, the 1st of December, is that what Ms. Ashton alluded to? Well, it wouldn't be logical if it were the 24th of November, would it? In Ms. Ashton's sum amendment, there are two changes. Mr. Godin's amendment, 1 hour instead of 2 hours per time slot per minister, at the latest by the 1st of December instead of the 24th of November. And that would, if we do this by the 1st of December, that would mean we'd have enough time for 2 meetings, an hour per minister. Is that correct? That's right. Good. Now, were there to be, well, let's just stick to what we're discussing. Ms. Ashton, you wanted to add something. This amendment is linked to the amendments I'd like to make in relation to point 2 and points 2 and 4, the purpose of which is to change the dates, and so that we have a realistic schedule in front of us. We've already lost several hours of meeting time during this parliamentary session. Now, from a procedural standpoint, would it be possible for me to share with members my other 2 amendments so that we can get a better sense, a realistic sense of the schedule that I'm proposing as we go forward? Yes, Mr. Godin, please proceed. Mr. Chairperson, with all due respect for my colleague Ms. Ashton from the New Democratic Party, last week I heard Ms. Ashton call upon us to uphold procedural rules, and it was decided that we would move ahead item by item. I didn't decide that. The committee decided as a whole, so I object to doing this in one fell swoop. I have reached out and looked for a compromise with the Liberal Party on several occasions. I've held out a perch and said to them, I'm prepared to withdraw my sub-amendment were Mr. Serre to withdraw his entire motion. And you're right, Ms. Ashton, when you made your presentation, when you spoke earlier, you talked about effectiveness and efficiency. And we have been discussing this motion moved by the Liberal Party for the past 6 meetings. This is unacceptable, egregious. I'm open. I want us to make headway. I want to stand up for French, but you can't accuse us of acting in bad faith. If you'd like to point the finger at any individual or any group, well, you know full well who you should be pointing the finger at. You have a relationship, a coalition, dare I say, with that particular group. So I won't budge an inch, says Mr. Godin. Ms. Ashton, yes, well, as I did with Mr. Beaulieu, once we've dealt with this amendment, we can vote on the sub-amendment and do whatever we need to do in due course.
Est-ce que vous nous dites que vous voulez le faire?
Is that all right with you, Ms. Ashton? Yes, certainly. I just want to clarify that the rest of what I will be proposing will seek to set out a realistic timeline. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. Are there any other questions about the sub-amendment? Only the sub-amendment now. Well, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, rather, I do appreciate my colleague's effort. She wants to bring things forward, move our work forward. However, just out of respect for procedure, I want to table a notice of motion. What we need are clear tools. We need to stop haggling over hours and calendar dates. I'm going to stop you there. We are talking about Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. Well, we're talking about times and dates. At a certain point, I need to table what I need to table. During the first meeting, you said that the chair is required to respect parliamentarians' speaking time, as long as there's at least some connection to the question at hand. Right now we're talking about hearing from ministers. And I believe that what Mr. Godin is saying has at least a little bit of a connection to that topic. Mr. Beaulieu? Mr. Godin had been stating that he would be opposing in some way Ms. Ashton's point. Look, Ms. Ashton is talking about dates. Here, it should be noted that I tabled an amendment to Mr. Saray's motion. I tabled it on November 1st. It had to do with dates. Why? Because I wanted to build off of Mr. Saray's motion. It talks about dates, and I'm talking about dates. I removed the section about limiting clause by clause. Now, out of good faith, Ms. Ashton is also tabling something. She's also extending an olive branch. Here's what I think. I think a procedural point needs to be raised. Ms. Ashton herself noted the importance of respecting parliamentary procedure, and I am entirely in favor of this. That's what you need to do in order for committees to work. In my November 10th notice of motion, instead of talking about dates, which is what Ms. Ashton is doing in point 1, I talked about a number of meetings. So I signaled a certain openness, an openness to talk about number of meetings, because you never know if technical issues will happen. When you set out specific dates, you're held to those dates. But over the last 3 meetings, as we've seen, there can be technical issues. That's no one's fault. It's not the fault of the Liberal NDP coalition. It's not the Bloc's fault. It's not the Conservative Party's fault. It's just a technical error. I'm going to interrupt you there. If you are to... Right now what you're talking about is maybe changing your point 1. I don't know what you're talking about, but it is not Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. If you wish to withdraw your amendment, you can do this with unanimous consent. I will only withdraw my amendment if the other side agrees to withdraw its own motion, because it makes no sense. It is 11:25 on November 24th. We've been wasting all sorts of time. And this all got started when the Liberals tabled their motion. Any other questions about Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment? First, Ms. Ashton. Then, Mr. Beaulieu. Yes, just to add something. I've wanted to table this amendment for a while now. On my end, I'm just trying to break up the logjam, let the committee advance, and let us improve the bill. That's what practically every witness has called on us to do. That's our goal. Could we move on to a vote on the amendment I've just proposed? Certainly, Ms. Ashton. But before we move on to a vote, we do need to make sure that everyone has had the chance to comment and speak about your sub-amendment. So Mr. Beaulieu has the floor. I think that scaling back the amount of time we will hear from ministers is unacceptable. Here's an example. Let's say we just hear from the Minister of Official Languages. We've already heard from her. We talked about C13. We asked questions. We asked questions in the House as well. And basically, she said that, 2 years ago in the throne speech, for the first ever time, the government recognized the decline of French. The first time in 50 years, even though French has been declining throughout that time. But now the government is finally admitting it. The government is also noting that there's 8 million Quebec Francophones who are part of a Canadian minority and part of a North American minority. So that's a great discovery on the part of the government. I think it's quite obvious, but they're finally admitting to common sense, and that's all great. The government is recognizing they don't need only to help out Quebec Anglophones, but also Quebec Francophones. So what we have done is we have asked the minister what will be done to help French, and she has not answered. The only thing she has pointed to is the section of the bill about federally regulated private businesses. And that section will actually prevent the Quebec government from applying the Charter of the French language to federally regulated private businesses. And that's not exactly going to help French. When you take that out, I don't know, maybe people are just trying to put on a little show and please the voters. But French is in decline everywhere. Look at Ontario. Look at the French-speaking community there. French has been in decline in Ontario. There are some researchers who are almost stating it's almost dead. So it's a serious situation. And there are things that could be done. Things that could be done to reverse the decline of French. But we haven't heard any answers from the part of the minister. I bring this up a lot. In Quebec, there are official language support programs. And I've brought this up in the House. I've repeated it at a number of points. I said, what is going to be done? Because right now, all the money is going towards the promotion of English in Quebec and the development of the Anglophone community in Quebec. We have nothing against Quebec Anglophones. Just the fact is, they're already part of a majority. They're already in a dominant position as part of the Canadian Anglophone majority. And yet we're being told, oh, sorry, according to the Official Languages Act, Anglophones are a minority in Quebec. So we're going to really try and strengthen this minority, even though they're actually part of a majority. So we need to hear about some concrete measures. Go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. Sorry, I just wasn't hearing you there. It's very important that we hear from every committee member. Yes, well, as I understand it, the motion is seeking to limit debate. But we absolutely cannot let the French language continue to lose ground. And right now, the Federal Official Languages Act is the main obstacle to preventing the decline of French, in Quebec at least. Maybe it's helpful in English Canada. Look at the question of positive measures. Right now, all of these measures are being used to help Anglophones. In the Official Languages Support Program, all they want to do is develop OLMCs. Roughly $1.5 billion has been spent in the last 30 or so years. And all of this money has gone towards the Anglophone education system in Quebec, which is already overfunded. The FCFA even carried out a study. We heard from the FCFA. They came before the committee. They've carried out a study. And what they did is compare Anglophones in Quebec to Francophones outside Quebec. And you could see that Anglophones inside Quebec are in a superior position, even compared to Quebec Francophones. This is true if you look at the number of schools, the number of graduates, etc. And yet the federal government is reinforcing these schools and these institutions. All they're doing is reinforcing English, despite Quebec being the only Francophone entity in North America. So we have asked all sorts of questions to the minister, and yet she has not been able to provide a response. When the Laurendeau-Dunton Commission was being carried out, it was stated that the Official Languages Act was not supposed to make everyone bilingual, because if everyone were to be bilingual, then the minority language would end up losing ground. Despite that, over $15 million a year are being used to promote the teaching of English in French schools. To be entirely frank, Chair, point of order. With all due respect, I know these are very important points, but my question is, what does this have to do with my amendment? I have already stated that I have other amendments I would like to propose. To me, it is very clear that we do need to move forward. I understand my colleagues' frustration, but I would like to understand the connection with my amendment. Well, there is somewhat of a link. Mr. Beaulieu is talking about how 1 hour per minister is not enough, because so far the minister's answers have not met the needs of Mr. Beaulieu or the Bloc. So as I understand it, that is the link. I would let Mr. Beaulieu continue. Point of order. Oh, Mr. Saray, over to you. We are willing to hear from ministers. We are willing to have them come before the committee. Mr. Saray, that is not a point of order. Mr. Beaulieu, unless you want to add anything, Mr. Godin. Inaudible. With all due respect, the only reason I'm talking now is because we're going to be gagged later. So I'm just trying to use the tools at my disposal as a parliamentarian to express myself. It's a question of minority rights. Everyone wags their finger at us saying that Quebecers don't respect minorities, but we are a minority, a Francophone minority. So that's why we need 2 hours per minister. I've already talked about the Minister of Official Languages whose programs are insufficient for Quebecers. Sometimes Quebecers even need to pay to get their documents translated into French. Look at Bill 104. Before 2002, Anglophone schools were saying, hey, send your students to us 6 months a year, and this will create a loophole. They will then be allowed to attend a public Anglophone school. Bill 104 undid this a little later. The federal government organized Alliance Québec, which appoints judges, and a certain judge was appointed and presented a ruling that was entirely in English. So people were quite shocked. Now look at the Access to Justice in Both Official Languages Fund. It gets roughly $525,000 a year. And yet the minister can't answer any questions about it. It looks like she's planning to continue funding programs without giving anything to Quebec francophones. There's no funding for the Organisme Droit Collectif du Québec. They're not getting funded by the federal government. So there are two different measures that exist but are not being equally funded. Look at the OLMC Development Fund. The federal government has noted that they are working with Alliance Québec to set up a coalition. When the Parti Québécois came to power back in the 80s, the federal government took action and funded certain organizations like Alliance Québec to oppose the status of French as the common language. The federal government wanted all the different services to be offered in English. Well, what does Bill 101 want? Bill 101 wants to set up French as the common language. What is a common language? That's a language that everyone is able to speak. This is the language that allows new immigrants to be integrated. It's what some people describe as linguistic racism. And that's what the federal government's opinion seems to be as well. So for me, I think it's entirely hypocritical to fund certain organizations, give them millions and millions of dollars every year. And all of this is to say I would like to hear from the minister. Is she going to continue funding organizations in this way? We have asked her over and over and over. So to have her here for just 1 hour, well, it would be very easy for her to slip away from answering questions. The same could be said for the Minister of Immigration. We've heard from him before. We know that the federal government is turning down 80% of applications from French-speaking African countries. We know how difficult it is to use French when dealing with border agents, even in Quebec. So we need clarification on this. The Minister of Immigration has come before the committee saying, oh, we don't really know, we don't understand. You know, in those African countries, Anglophones also get turned away, so it's not discrimination. But of course, those countries represent the main pool of Francophone immigration candidates. His department really does not seem to respect French, even in Quebec. So we've asked questions and no answers. We've gotten no answers at all. We've heard about threats to French. We've heard about threats to global linguistic diversity. We've all heard about biological diversity, but linguistic diversity is also very important. And right now, in North America, there is just one Francophone jurisdiction, Quebec. And we would hope that the immigration minister would be able to come answer these questions.
C'est pas assez long. Et savoir.
1 hour isn't long enough. And this will help guide our debate in the clause-by-clause consideration that will follow. So I think this is crucial. If you look at the Treasury Board, for example, the same is true in the case of that department. And all the funding that's handed out. Can the Treasury Board give us information? And public accounts? Whose bailiwick is that? There are a lot of mistakes in the public accounting when it comes to the Official Languages Act. You know, certain officials have said no thanks. Canadian Heritage doesn't want to appear. Other departments don't want to appear. Some departments have responded, but it was really tough getting answers and really drawn out. We need ministers to appear before us. We need to hear them speak, answer our questions. We need to have an opportunity to put pressure on them so that they tell us what things are like at the moment. Canadian Heritage and the Finance Department, they hand out grants and subsidies. Is it normal that Canadian Heritage funds organisations that interfere in elections, that lobby the Quebec government in an area of jurisdiction that is supposed to be exclusively a provincial one? It just doesn't make sense that they should proceed in that manner. Now, gagging debate on this legislation, limiting the number of witnesses we are able to hear from, it just doesn't make sense. We're told, on the one hand, that linguistic duality is a fundamental value in Canada, and yet the very opposite is on display in the Parliament of Canada and in this bill. And we're told, oh, you won't be able to debate this in clause-by-clause consideration. You won't have witnesses appear before you who'll be able to answer your questions. It doesn't make sense. The Minister of Canadian Heritage, well, we want to hear from her. And I don't know if Health Canada's on the guest list, but those organisations boast that they got funding. If you look at the official languages health fund, they want to anglicise the healthcare system. They want to have CLSCs and hospitals on the boards of administration, all these youth centres. And at some point, we were able to stem the tide. There was only one single university, a Francophone university rehabilitation centre in Montreal at one point that merged with a small Anglophone rehabilitation centre, the Lindsay Centre. And quite obviously, the board of directors was being controlled by Anglo organisations. They moved a motion with a view to ensuring that McGill University would get all the profits from that when they were affiliated with the Université de Montréal. And there were two branches that, or two people that objected to this, that knocked on the door of the minister, that it wasn't right, that the Anglophone majority is getting service and not Francophones, and, you know, that it was the department or ministry wasn't allowed to hire unilingual Anglophones, and that the documents should be in French and not just in English. There were demonstrations in front of the rehabilitation centre, and the upshot of that was that the office would conduct investigations, and over 90% of the clientele was Francophone, and yet they were able to anglicise the apparatus in a backdoor manner. All of this money that's being spent to anglicise Quebec government institutions, including municipal ones. There's nothing as a counterpoint in Quebec. I was at the Saint-Baptiste Society for a long time, and we didn't get any money from the government. The federal government basically is ensuring that we don't have the same means at our disposal, and there is an anglicisation occurring. We need to have a fulsome debate. We need to hear from ministers. We should be able to hear from them. Well, 2 hours actually isn't enough. We should be able to question them until we get the answers we want. But at least 2 hours. If it's 1 hour per minister, they're going to be making a mockery of us and laughing in our faces. It just doesn't make sense. And listen, Quebecers and Canadians aren't aware of what's going on. Maybe we'll poll them at some point and ask them what percentage of grants under the Official Languages Act goes to Anglophones and goes to Francophones. There are very few Canadians and Quebecers that would be in the know. Perhaps going to be slightly off base here or exaggerating when I say it's 100% in favour of Anglophones. It's only for teaching French in English schools that there's a slightly high proportion of grants that go to Francophones. And we know that the quality of French is suffering. Recently, the Federation of Students of Cégeps spoke out asking for French to be strengthened as opposed to the teaching of English. Now, what this demonstrates is that 2 hours is the bare minimum. And this attempt to gag us needs to cease. The New Democrats have often given us the sense that they're in favour of the future of French and supporting it. And some of them give us some of them tried to tell us that we believe that we're better than Francophones are better than others, but that's not what we're fighting. We're fighting for collective social justice, the right to self-determination, and this right has been flouted by the federal government since time immemorial, since colonisation, in fact. And especially since 1867. Now, I won't delve too much into the annals of history because you'll cut me off, but in 2022, 2023, we need to put an end to this. Let's nip it in the bud. We can't continue to go backwards if we aren't able to speak up, to speak out, if folks aren't aware, can't see that there's a public debate and that at least there's an openness to discussing these issues. Well, I think that will show a modicum of democracy is still alive. Quebec is a minority in Anglophone Canada, and when the Anglophone majority is not in agreement with us, they'll always try and undo our legislation and try and stymie us. But at least if we can speak up here, at least if we can debate issues without being muzzled, well, I think that's a step in the right direction. And the worst, at the very least, if we're able to question ministers and have enough time to do so, I'm a sovereigntist. I don't believe at the end of the day that we can survive in Canada, in North America, in French. Now, but at least, I mean, the Federalists would have an opportunity to show that they're allowing French to survive in Canada, but the C13 doesn't support that rhetoric at all. Mr. Godin. No, I asked for the floor, Mr. Serré. You've already had the floor. Do you want to speak after me, sir? Mr. Chair. Well, I just want to make sure that everyone around the table knows what we're trying to discuss and decide upon. Now, when we started sitting as new members of the Standing Official on Committed Languages, we discussed certain rules and the standing orders. The speaking time of members, 5 minutes. First round of questions, 6 minutes for the Conservatives, 6 minutes for the Liberals, 6 for the Bloc, 6 for the New Democrats. That's 24 minutes. Plus 5 minutes, that's 29 minutes in total. Now, there's a proposal on the table, 4 ministers for 2 meetings, not even 2 meetings. Hold on, let me do my math properly. I don't want to mislead you, Mr. Chair. 1 hour per minister for 2 meetings. And now, logically, if there are no changes, no technical issues, no votes, no this or that, well, that would finish up around, on the 1st of December, wouldn't it? Now, Mr. Chair, I moved a notice of motion, and my colleague, Mr. Drouin, on Tuesday, said that notice had been made public because I read it out loud. Now, if you look at Ms. Ashton's proposal, I understand that she's trying to end this roadblock, and that's great that she's doing that. But my proposal is that we have 2 hours per minister, including their officials. Now, under Ms. Ashton's proposal, it doesn't include officials. Now, if we have 1 hour per minister for a grand total of 4 hours, that's 1 hour per minister, including the officials. What my colleague from the Bloc was saying a moment ago is a bare minimum. And it won't even allow us to ask in-depth questions. There are 4 members of the Conservative Party of Canada. Mr. Chairperson, a point of order, says Ms. Ashton. Go ahead, please. Well, I just want to clarify things here. When we referred to officials, I just want to make sure that we're talking about representatives here. Yes, Ms. Ashton, you're right. Your amendment, Mr. Godin, well, the change proposed is 2 hours to 1 hour, or 1 hour to 2 hours, and that includes officials. Well, I'm talking about my notice of motion, which is still in abeyance. And in the notice of motion, it stipulates, and their officials. Before going further, Mr. Chairperson, would it be possible to get the wording of Ms. Ashton's proposed amendment? Did we receive it in our P9 accounts? Did you send it as one email? Well, hold on. We're talking about officials, representatives, dates. Let's just give the clerk a moment to take a big breath and to get her ducks in a row. We'll be sharing Ms. Ashton's sub-amendments in a moment, and you'll get that in your P9 accounts.
OK, on est en voie de...
Okie doke, you'll be getting that in your P9 accounts, Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment, that is. So that email has been sent, Mr. Godin. I'll just wait till I receive the document before I... Let's resume. I think everyone's had an opportunity to read Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. The floor is yours, Mr. Godin. Well, basically, the Minister will be there for an hour and we'll have an opportunity to ask officials questions too. I think this is unacceptable. But listen, it's 5 minutes to midday on the 24th of November, 2022. Listen to this. I'm ready to support the Conservative Party and accept this sub-amendment on the proviso that Ms. Ashton doesn't force a clause by clause with the time allocation or any time limits I'll open the door to that, but I will never give an inch when it comes to clause-by-clause consideration. So I'm prepared to sacrifice my time asking ministers and officials questions, but what I won't do, and I swear this over my dead body, I will not forgo anything when it comes to clause-by-clause consideration. I'm going to stand up for French, and I'm going to ensure that my rights as a parliamentarian are not flouted. Well, we'll be voting on the sub-amendment and then your amendment, and when we get to that point, you can do as you see fit. Well, what I'm calling for, Mr. Chair, is unanimous consent so that Ms. Ashton can, if she's on the same page as me, that she can agree to this, and then we can move on to something else. Ms. Ashton has made a proposal to amendment number 1. You're asking for unanimous consent, calling on Ms. Ashton to amend paragraphs that she still hasn't submitted as part of her amendment. No, what I'm saying is I'm calling for unanimous consent. And the Conservative Party of Canada is prepared to accept her sub-amendment on the sole proviso that later down the track she doesn't come at us with a sub-amendment to do with clause-by-clause consideration with a deadline for as to when debate would end. Well, I've never heard of that kind of thing, asking for an undertaking from someone that about something that hasn't yet even been read out. But let's see if there's unanimous consent. Is there? No, there isn't. Well, there you have it. So, Mr. Beaulieu, you, unless I'm mistaken, the floor was yours. Ms. Ashton, would you agree to that? But she hasn't called for the floor, and therefore I imagine that she wants to maintain this gag order. Well, point of order. Please stick to Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. Okie doke. Well, there's one thing that I wanted to mention that's quite important, and it's this. Why would we ask questions of ministers of the Treasury Board? Well, when the CEO of Statistics Canada appeared before us, we wanted him to disclose the outcomes of his study on rights holders. And the FCFA and Acadian and Francophone communities cared very much about this. And he said that he couldn't. He needed the minister's authority. You're referring to the chief statistics officer. Yes, that's correct. And that surprised me because it was my understanding that Statistics Canada was at arm's length, given the importance of what they do. They're supposed to be objective when it comes to the state of French in Canada and Quebec. And yet, no, he said, I need to ask the minister for permission before I release any of that information. Now, there's Mr. Corbet, who's a former employee of Statistics Canada, and he was there throughout all the presentations and briefs. And he suggested that the language of use at home, that the mother tongue, that's not what's most important, and that one needed to take into account a whole slew of indicators. But the mother tongue, the language of work, the language used at home, these indicators all point in the same direction and are a clear portrait of the state of affairs when it comes to French.
And now what we hear, it's linguistic racism. Because we cited as one piece of data about mother tongue. Well, that piece of data comes from StatsCan. And the 1982 Constitution is based around mother tongue, so I think it's quite something to accuse us of linguistic racism. That would mean StatsCan is also guilty of linguistic racism. And all of this has a major effect on organisms funded through the OLA. And we hear that, Quebecers are closed-minded, Quebecers don't respect minorities. One person even referred to Jim Crow laws in the States. But it's not the case. We are a minority in Canada. Our demographic weight is still in decline because immigration is increasing, but Quebec is being prevented from teaching French to immigrants. It's not about just getting as many Francophones over as possible. I have always been very clear on this point. All people need to be included. All newcomers need to be included in Quebec society. But in order for that to happen, they do need to be able to speak French. And the department seems to be countering this. For 50 years, people have been denying that French is in decline and have been opposing our measures and supporting measures that anglicize Quebec. Even StatsCan, who, as I understand it, is controlled by the minister because they need ministerial approval to come before the committee, even StatsCan said, yes, there has been an increase in the number of Francophones in Quebec and Canada, but at the same time, their proportion of as part of the population has declined. Recently, we have been calling on the government to support linguistic diversity. The government has at any rate. They've noted that there are different languages being used at home, but when these people end up speaking English, well, that's not linguistic diversity, that's linguistic assimilation. And that's what StatsCan has noted. I believe that StatsCan should be relatively independent. So that's why I would like to ask some questions to the minister. Yes, but StatsCan is not part of any department mentioned in the motion. Well, yes, but what we're talking about is limiting the amount of time we have to ask questions to ministers who have the ability to restrict what is or is not published by StatsCan. So that's why I'm bringing this up. If StatsCan was completely independent, I would agree. It would have nothing to do with this debate. But it turns out that StatsCan is not completely independent because it requires ministerial approval. So that's what's going on. What we need is the time to question ministers. Look at Heritage Canada. They distribute subsidies. Why are they giving money to divisive organizations that pit Francophones and Quebecers against one another, that anglicize immigrants to Quebec? The minister will absolutely need to answer this question. If the indicator used is first official language spoken, which in turn is based on mother tongue, because, if it's racist to use indicators like that, then the whole federal government is racist. That's not what I'm saying. That's what we're hearing. I don't understand how the federal government is comfortable giving subsidies to organizations that do things like this, that harm the integration of immigrants, something vital for Quebec. And then they point the finger at Quebec and call us racists? What we're trying to do is integrate newcomers. And the problem we're having is that the Official Languages Act that we want to question ministers about, seeks to integrate new immigrants into the Anglophone community, into the Canadian Anglophone society, into the majority. And really, that goes against our right to self-determination, which comes from international law, and it also includes the right to succeed. So I'd really like to ask the minister some questions about that. I'd like to ask, is it racist to defend French in Quebec? I'd like to have the chance to follow that line of questioning. And what my colleague is proposing would give us only 6 minutes to ask questions. And after that 6 minutes, the bloc and the NDP will have less and less speaking time, because that's how we do things in our committee. So over 1 hour, 1 hour is just not enough. We will hardly be able to ask questions to the ministers. I think it is entirely unacceptable, entirely inadequate. And that's why I would call on all members here to vote against this sub-amendment. I am extending an olive branch to the NDP. Ever since the NDP got in bed with the Liberals, well, they've turned from being a minority government to a majority government. So we need to do our best to get our ideas out on the table now, rather than later. I had thought that the NDP was the party of social justice. Mr. Beaulieu, please keep your remarks to the sub-amendment. Ms. Ashton, you are the next to speak. Over to you. Okay, I'd like to reiterate that I proposed this sub-amendment in order to move our work forward, in order to break up the logjam and let us improve the bill. I have been eminently clear since the March of May. The bill needs improvements. It needs to be improved in line with the recommendations made by the witnesses who have come before our committee. That is why I tabled my sub-amendment. I appreciate the remarks from the other side, but I have been very clear. I want to move forward. I have been an MP for 14 years. I don't move motions unless I believe in them. So I would caution my colleague against assuming my intentions. Look at the actual wording of my sub-amendment. Again, I want us to move forward. I want us to make a difference for Francophone communities across the country who have stated that they want a modernized Official Languages Act and they want it as quickly as possible. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. Mr. Godin, go ahead. And then Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Chair, I would like to recognize the efforts of my colleague. I hope she is able to appreciate my offer, and my offer also shows that I want us to move forward. Unfortunately, it seems to have been entirely ignored. Here's a question. On June 13th, 2022, we in this committee made a decision. There would be 20 meetings and then a closed-door sitting to decide the future of C-13. Have we had our 20 meetings? Technically speaking, we have not had 20 meetings because we started talking about the motion instead. The motion stopped the clock, if you will. So we're at 14, 15, 16 meetings. Because that's only counting meetings with witnesses. Okay. Now, Chair, I understand all the arguments that have been raised. I do not believe that we have done all in our power to handle this issue properly. We're being told there's an emergency. We know that Francophone communities across Canada, including in Quebec, want us to move forward, as well as Anglophone communities in Quebec. However, I will note that the Liberal government has been in power for 7 years. If they wanted to modernize the act, they've had 7 years. Suddenly a magic fairy comes out of the sky and says, oh, no, we need to move forward. We need to get it done before the holidays. That makes no sense. You would think that the government would want to protect francophones. And this issue is very important as a parliamentarian. Mr. Godin, please keep your remarks to the sub-amendment. I have made an offer. I am now willing to support the sub-amendment as long as Ms. Ashton comes back and offers something in exchange. I am being transparent. I want to move forward. I am extending an olive branch to the other side. I am asking for unanimous consent, and unanimous consent to take all the motions and amendments off the table. Chair, no. There have been extensive discussions. I have called for unanimous consent. I've never told Ms. Ashton to take her amendment away. I'm calling on a blank slate. We take everything off the table and set out a timeline. And again, as I have noted, I do not want to stick to dates. I have noted this already. I want to speak in terms of number of meetings. And I will not agree to a restriction of clause by clause. Mr. Godin, I have heard you. It's possible. But right now, we are talking about Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment, and we will need to go through it one point at a time. Are you challenging my ruling? Chair, I respect this institution. I respect your work because I know it's not easy to be a chair, and I will not challenge your ruling. Mr. Beaulieu. We're still talking about Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. She spoke, and I'd like to answer her. I do not want to put words in her mouth. However, typically, our intentions are expressed through our actions. I simply do not see how restricting speaking time for ministers will help the French language. She always goes back to the argument, oh, there are groups out there who want a modernized act, an act modernized as quickly as possible. Well, if the government truly wishes to help French and help francophones outside Quebec, well, they can take action right away. They don't need a modernized act. For example, they can alter the funding given to them. They can appoint a governor general who can actually speak French, and lieutenant governors who speak French. We know that despite the current existence of the Official Languages Act, public servants don't feel comfortable speaking French in the workplace. We need to hear from ministers about these issues, and we have not heard answers. It's really quite stunning. The government is in power. They don't need a special law to give instructions to their public servants. They can say, follow the instructions, meet objectives. They could get the departments to meet Francophone immigration objectives. But just to get back to the matter at hand, I want to have a chance to ask questions to ministers. Sure, there are certain groups whom I respect, like the FCFA, like certain Francophone OLMC groups. These are people who are far worse off than Quebec Francophones. These are groups that have undergone assimilation. I commend them for their courage and for their determination to keep living in French to the extent possible, despite the considerable duress they find themselves in on a day-to-day basis. However, respectfully, 90% of Canadian Francophones live in Quebec. I do need to make that point. There's all sorts of of groups that work to promote French. I don't know all of them, but I know that they do not all agree that the OLA needs to be modernized in this way. Some of us are calling on a major sea change, and more they are turning to the media because if parliamentarians are muzzled, despite the fact that we're up in a parliament and it's supposed to be the place where we can have democratic discussions, it's supposed to be the place where we can get certain views stated, but if we can't do it here, then these groups will turn to the media. At a certain point, we need to restore people's faith in democracy, their faith in our ability to change things. Because right now, I'm all for nonviolence. I hope nonviolence can remain in place, and to do that, you need democracy. And democracy is not muzzling people. Only a minority of Canadian Francophones believe that this act, as written, is a good one. Most people do not believe that the bill will help French, despite everything that we have been told. Bill C-13 will not change things. We have asked so many questions to ministers. What will actually help French? Oh, well, we're the first government to recognize the decline of French. Oh, that's fine. That's great. That's all very well and good. We agree with that. But aside from that, what are you going to do? Ministers have not answered these questions. We need answers. And we need time to ask them questions. Anyone else? Okay, we will move on to a vote.
Oops. Monsieur Serry. Madame Latanzio.
Oui.
Madame Kayabaga.
Oui.
Monsieur Iacono.
Oui.
Monsieur Drouin.
En faveur.
Monsieur Dalton.
Pour.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame la greffière, je fais confiance à Madame Ashton et je vais voter pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Contre.
Madame Ashton.
Pour.
10 pour, 1 contre.
10 yeas, 1 nay. The sub-amendment is carried. We'll just stop quickly. Because normally, we would then vote on Mr. Godin's sub-amended amendment, but there are some questions about dates, so we will. I'm just going to pause briefly.
Oui.
Okay, so this was a tad unusual. There are a number of sub-amendments that would amend the main amendment that also refer back. Well, inaudible for the interpreter. No microphone. Now, let's be serious here. In order to get out of the woods, I think we should proceed step by step. We just passed a sub-amendment. Congratulations, everyone. Now we'll vote on Mr. Godin's amendment. No. Point of order. Rather than voting on all of the sub-amendments together, we agreed we'd do one at a time. But should we... Are you referring to the sub-amendments? You just said that we would look at them one at a time. But now you're going back on that and saying we do lump them all together. Well, listen, this is really unusual, and there are so many amendments and so many sub-amendments. But if there's consensus, we can proceed in that manner. We can pass all the sub-amendments first, one at a time. But here's what we can do. One, we deal with Mr. Godin's amendment first, knock it back or accept it, and then refer back to the main amendment on the same paragraph. We can do that in one vote. Another option, we can hear all Ms. Ashton's sub-amendments together that would amend Mr. Joël Godin's amendments, and when that's done, we could look at Mr. Serre's main motion. Now, I want to hear your opinions. This is a procedural issue, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and everyone understands. Well, that's very apropos, Mr. Chair. Now, the first option that you just proposed, we voted on Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment, and you're saying we can now turn our attention to Mr. Godin's amendment. And what I'm saying is we can't move to Ms. Ashton's second sub-amendment because we have to deal with the first point of the main motion. And we have to do this all together. That's what I've been trying to say from the beginning. This is a waste of time because we're talking about dates here. We're trying to do things in a vacuum. And this is like a mouse in a wheel that's turning around and around and around. Well, listen, everything has to do here with paragraph 1. Your first amendment amended paragraph 1 of the amendment, and Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment that was just agreed to is in the same vein. So we've got option 1 or option 2. Option 2 is to do it all together. We can try and reach a consensus or... Well, Mr. Chair, if I may, you're changing the game rules in the middle of the game. We agreed from the outset, and we agreed on this around the table. I thought we had unanimous consent that we would proceed point by point, 1 point at a time. And I think we need to stick to the same process. I think that we should address Ms. Ashton's other sub-amendments now, and then go to Godin's, and then to Serre's. That's what we agreed to. Why would we change things halfway through? But that was what we agreed on. Those were the game rules we agreed on. That's what we agreed on, before you contradict me. Yes, that we would take it step by step. Now, there are 5 amendments. And, there's Mr. Godin's amendment that we would be voting on first that would amend paragraph 1 of the main motion. That's one piece of the puzzle. But our practice has been, since the beginning, since Mr. Serre moved his motion, we'd start with the last one. Now, if I use the expression that you coined, Mr. Chairperson, we'd go backwards, start from the end and move our way through to the beginning. I don't want to necessarily change the game rules. So you favour option 2. Does everyone else? When I moved my amendments, says Mr. Beaulieu, you said we would address them one at a time and we would see that through to the end. Otherwise, well, okay, I agree. Ms. Ashton, would you like to move your next sub-amendment, please? Yes, indeed. It would be my pleasure to do so. We can't hear you, Ms. Ashton. Your volume's very low. Perhaps you've unplugged your headset. No, my headset is plugged in. Please proceed. The amendments to Bill C-13 be submitted to the clerk in both official languages by 5 p.m. Thursday, 1st of December 2022, and distributed to members of the committee in both official languages before 5 p.m. Thursday, December 2, 2022. Now, while the clerk is submitting that by email, could you please repeat what you just said out loud for the benefit of committee members?
OK. Je vais juste...
Okie doke. Amendments to Bill C-13 be submitted to the clerk in both official languages by 5 p.m. Thursday, 1st of December 2022, and distributed to members of the committee in both official languages before noon, 5 p.m. Friday, 2nd of December 2022. So 5 p.m. in both cases, just by way of clarification.
Parfait.
Perfect. The clerk has sent that out to your P9 accounts. So amendments to Bill C-13 be submitted to the clerk in both official languages by 5 p.m. the 1st of December 2022 and distributed to members of the committee in both official languages by 5 p.m. on the 2nd of December 2022. So I think that everyone's received the second sub-amendment from Ms. Ashton in their P9 accounts. Mr. Beaulieu. Now, we have until the 1st of December to submit our amendments. We've already said that this is one of the most complicated and one of the biggest pieces of legislation that we've seen in a long time, perhaps even the biggest bill of any reforms that have been made to date to the Official Languages Act. And it's all the more complicated by virtue of the fact that, well, I even asked a lawyer's opinion on this and asked him to take a look at it. And he told us that this bill is susceptible to a gag order. And it's almost as if he had a crystal ball and knew that there might be a gag order here. In this bill, there are clauses that retroactively amend previous sections. Now, if we pass a number of amendments, for example, to the new legislation on federally regulated businesses, if we pass some amendments right off the bat and we end up with the new legislation that is enacted that would amend retroactively previous amendments. Listen, this is very complicated, and I think this will open us up to issues. If we proceed in a roughshod manner, well, we won't have heard from the ministers, and they won't provide us food for thought in terms of amendments that we might bring forward. And worse still, if were the clause-by-clause consideration to be subject to a gag order, well then, we won't even have time to bring forward all the amendments we need to. And we'll end up undoing what has been previously done. And it'll be very difficult to get the changes through that we are in favour of. So here's what I'm in favour of. We need to have enough time to bring forward our amendments to make sure that things match up, and that when an amendment is passed, well, folks need to be advised, and things need to match up further later in the bill. Otherwise, we'll end up undoing what we've just done, and that's quite a complicated task. It's a real pity that we're being rushed here, and that they're trying to muzzle us on such an important matter. Well, I'm looking on the Zoom screen. I'm looking around the table. Anyone else want to speak? Madam Clerk, please.
Oh, excuse-moi.
I apologize. I wasn't watching.
Manger le biscuit pas mal vite.
Yeah, well, we are being kind of rushed, aren't we?
Oui, oui, c'est bon. Comme je sais, ben oui.
Madame Latanzio.
Oui.
Madame Kayabaga.
En faveur.
Monsieur Iacono.
En faveur.
Monsieur Drouin.
En faveur.
Monsieur Dalton.
Oui.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame la greffière, je sais qu'on est dans un...
Madam Clerk, I know we're voting, but I'm going to support this despite myself.
Monsieur Lehoux.
En faveur.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Moi, je suis pas capable d'aller dans ce sens-là parce que...
Well, I can't go along with that. This is unacceptable, so I'm going to vote against it.
Ashton.
Oui.
10 pour, un contre adopté.
Donc 10 pour, 1 contre.
10 for, 2 against the sub-amendment of Ms. Ashton to second amendment of Mr. Godin is carried. The floor is yours, Ms. Ashton. I'm so surprised. We're actually making some headway here. Well, a huge thank you to fellow committee members. And point 3 is unchanged. Point 4, that the committee proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of the bill by Tuesday, 6th of December 2022, 11 Eastern Standard Time.
Donc,
So the 6th of December, that's the only change under amendment or sub-amendment 4.
Oui, c'est ça.
That's right. And also we added the time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Well, 11 a.m. was already in Mr. Godin's amendment, Ms. Ashton, at least in my draft of the document. So I'll just repeat your sub-amendment before the clerk sends it out to your P9 accounts. So paragraph 3 remains as is. Amendment 4, Mr. Godin, would read as follows. According to Ms. Ashton's proposal, the committee proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of the bill by the Tuesday, 6th of December 2022, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
d'ici quelques secondes.
Now, in a couple of seconds, you'll have that in writing. It's been sent out to your P9s. Mr. Godin, you raised your hand. Please proceed. I'm listening to you. Well, I just want to make sure, just like a school teacher, well, we do like the naughty students. School teachers often do like the naughty students. Now, has everyone received that in your P9 accounts? I see people are nodding their heads. I take it for granted. Well, the sub-amendment 3 is a sub-amendment to Mr. Godin's 4th amendment. Is that clear? Mr. Godin, you wanted to speak? Go ahead. As my colleague said, the devil is in the details. Yes, absolutely, sir. I have nothing against the English, but I'm going to stand up for French. That the committee proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of the bill by Tuesday, the 6th of December. Well, Mr. Chairperson, I want to be consistent here in what I have to say. what's going to happen between the 1st and the 6th of December? I would prefer that clause be replaced not by a date, but by one single meeting, i.e. the meeting that follows the final appearance by a minister. Otherwise, on the 6th of December, we're going to continue to waste our time. Let's make this easier for ourselves. And as Ms. Ashton said just now, she was a tad surprised. But she and I share the same goal, and that is to move this file forward. She doesn't need to be surprised with this kind of proposal. Mr. Chairperson, when you're in a committee context, there's give and take, and one should be able to expect openness on the part of other committee members. I'm not comfortable with a specific date being included here, but I agree, given what we just voted on, that we would have a meeting following the final testimony from the fourth minister. Anyone else? Mr. Beaulieu, please proceed. Just to clarify things here, please. If I've understood correctly, this has to do with point 4. It's a sub-amendment to Mr. Godin's fourth amendment. So that means that the clause-by-clause consideration would start on the 6th of December, or would it conclude on the 6th of December? It would start at the latest on the 6th of December. Yes, start. Not conclude, start. Yes, start. Okay. Well, I don't agree, because that would mean that were there to be a vote or an emergency debate or on one evening, we have a debate until midnight, and under the new motion there would be no requirement for unanimous consent to extend debate. But when debate is extended, committees cannot sit the following day. Now, if the Liberals would control the agenda with the New Democrats who are in bed with them, and we wouldn't need unanimous consent. All we'd need would be the support of one leader, i.e. one party. And of course, that would be the New Democrats, wouldn't it? And were that to occur, we might have no meetings and wouldn't hear from any minister. And that can sometimes happen before Parliament rises. And were that to happen, that would put a further limitation on the appearances by ministers. So at a bare minimum, if we have only 1 hour per minister, well, that would be 2 meetings, wouldn't it? And clause-by-clause consideration would start after those 2 meetings, after we will have heard from all 4 ministers. I don't know if my colleague will agree to this and amend her sub-amendment so that it reads, well, that it referred to meetings rather than dates, because we actually might end up not hearing from ministers at all. If we're lucky, we might end up having one of the 2 meetings, and then we'd end up with a situation where we don't even hear from some of the ministers. And as I said earlier, it's crucial that we have an opportunity to speak to each and every minister. Well, in relation to this point of order, if someone submits an amendment or a sub-amendment, it can't be amended on the hop. On a point of order.
I think you're missing something. You can amend your sub-amendment with unanimous consent. I will let Mr. Beaulieu finish. Well, as long as Ms. Ashton is agreed, I'm sure we could get unanimous consent. Over to you, Ms. Ashton. You are muted, Ms. Ashton. Sorry. I think a few good points have been raised. It is clear that my intention, as stated, was to have 1 hour per minister. I do think it's important that we protect that. I do recognize as well that things might get complicated depending on what happens in Parliament. With unanimous consent, I would suggest that we keep the spirit of the amendment while clarifying that the committee proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of the bill no later than the meeting following the 2 meetings with ministers and officials. That way we would have 1 hour with each minister. It will take up 2 meetings, and we would then move on to the beginning of clause-by-clause at the following meeting. This is virtually the same as what I have already proposed, but it would entrench a full hour with each minister and their staff. Ms. Ashton, the clerk is taking notes. Could you please repeat what you are asking to do through unanimous consent? Yes. I would like to amend point 4 so it says the committee proceed with clause-by-clause consideration of the bill no later than the meeting following the 2 meetings with ministers and their staff. So instead of saying December 6th, which is still our goal, but instead of stating it, we would refer to a 4-hour period in which ministers are questions. Thank you. We'll just let the clerk get this all in black and white, and then it will be distributed to the P9 accounts. Mr. Godin, would you like to speak now, or would you like to wait for the document? Well, of course, everything I say is very important. That's certainly true. Yes, 2 quick points, Chair. First, I would like to commend Ms. Ashton's flexibility. I would like to see something similar from the Liberals, but, we'll leave it there for now. I would like to suggest one other thing. No. It's very much on point. I mean, if we don't like it, we'll just vote against. I think the phrase no later than is not necessary. We could just write at the meeting following the meetings with the 4 ministers. I don't think we need to include no later than, but that's just a linguistic issue. That was an important point, was it not? Well, Ms. Ashton is the one requesting unanimous consent, so I'd like to hear what she thinks. And then we'll move on to a unanimous consent. I'm fine with that suggestion. I think it means the same thing either way. We are still aiming for December 6th, but it's good to clarify that we do need to hear from the 4 ministers for 1 hour per minister, and then begin clause by clause. Chair? Mr. Saray, over to you. Let's say the Bloc and the Conservatives have clearly noted their desire to filibuster. We need a date, otherwise we will deny unanimous consent. They've been filibustering for weeks now. Very quickly, I've seen your hands. Just one moment.
Donc,
all right. That is to say, unanimous consent. We've not received unanimous consent to allow Ms. Ashton to amend her sub-amendment, so we will go back to the sub-amendment as originally worded. Can we suspend, Chair? Inaudible. I have not suspended. Can I finish what I had to say? Would you grant me permission to finish my sentence? I was going to note that we will return to debate on the sub-amendment as originally worded, referring to an end date of December 6th. That's what I was about to say. Mr. Beaulieu had the floor, followed by Mr. Godin. I find that shameful. Not once has the party in power come to speak with the Bloc Québécois or the other opposition party to find a solution. They're saying, oh, you did this, you did that, but they haven't even come and sat down with us to have a discussion. Instead, they moved straight to a gag order. Inaudible. Oh, you have a point of order. Over to you, Mr. Godin. Well, Chair, earlier, you stated that there was not unanimous consent on something that we had not even read. Could we not get the wording of Ms. Ashton's revised proposal? Then you can put the question to the committee, and then we will understand whether people are for or against. Right now, things are unclear. Inaudible for the interpreter. One moment. When you propose to amend a sub-amendment which is already been tabled, well, you're outside the rulebook at that point, and I would be able to shoot it down. But unanimous consent is unanimous consent. So what I will say is now we are going back to the date of December 6th, which was originally proposed by Ms. Ashton in her sub-amendment. It amends point 4 of Mr. Godin's amendment. Have I been clear? Inaudible. No, this is point 3 of Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. Ms. Ashton has moved a third sub-amendment. This third sub-amendment would amend point 4 of Mr. Godin's amendment. On that note, Mr. Beaulieu, over to you. Well, I will be voting against. We have not even been able to guarantee for hours with ministers. We do need to hear from ministers. We need to hear their answers to our questions. Especially the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Minister Rodriguez. Here, I have this article where he talks about wanting to have more French at the Emergency Measures Commission. We have already seen some journalists note that Francophone witnesses have felt obliged to testify in English because there wasn't enough space for French set aside in that debate. So the Minister of Canadian Heritage, he seems to agree with this idea. He wants there to be more French. Well, here's the question. What part of C13 would ensure that there's more French? And we would like to ask some questions about that. We would also like to, well, you know, this is a government-wide initiative, but we know that Quebec's new bill, Bill 96, sets out a December 1st timeline for businesses to sign up with the OQLF and respect the Charter of the French language. Because back in 87, Bill 101 was amended. It was expanded to include federally regulated private businesses. A deadline was set out, December 1st. So I find it a little eyebrow-raising that, oh, suddenly, you know, CN, Air Canada, all these companies are coming out and saying they do not want to sign up with the OQLF. Well, that means that after December 1st, they're going to be in breach of the law to a certain extent. That's why the government has imposed a gag order to ensure that the bill is passed by December 1st. But, you know, we have to study things in detail. I'm sorry, Mr. Beaulieu, I don't really follow you. Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment talks about a December 6th deadline. Exactly. And she's only referring to the beginning of clause by clause. Well, my point is more to do with... It's less to do with the December 6th and more to do with the fact of having 2 full meetings and more to do with the refusing of unanimous consent. We're being accused of filibustering. Well, who's causing problems, you know? The muzzle being set out by the government is also kind of like a type of filibuster. It also limits democratic debate. In my view, we absolutely need to have time to ask questions to ministers. Earlier, we were talking about 2 hours per minister. Now we're talking about 1 hour. Mr. Beaulieu, we have already gone over this. That was back in her first sub-amendment. Just to remind you, we are not now talking about Ms. Ashton's third sub-amendment. Exactly, and that says that clause by clause would start... I need to look at the wording. I will read it out to you. It says, the committee proceed with clause by clause consideration of the bill no later than Tuesday, December 6th, 2022. Chair, it's not with the word no later than. Ms. Ashton has already agreed to remove that part of the wording. Yes, but there was no unanimous consent. Unanimous consent was to change the reference to a date to a reference to meetings. It had nothing to do with the no later than.
Non, on me dit, monsieur.
No, Mr. Godin, there was no unanimous consent. But honestly, the two wordings are virtually identical. Mr. Beaulieu, over to you. Oh, and I have not forgotten you, Mr. Dalton. So it says no later than December 6th. This means that if a debate gets extended or something like that happens, we might not have the chance to hear from ministers. I will note that I commend Ms. Ashton for agreeing to protect the 2 meetings. But I also want to note that if her objective is truly to get 2 meetings, then we'll need to vote against her sub-amendment and see how things develop. Setting out a date of December 6th puts the fact of having 2 meetings at risk. Because clause by clause would suddenly start even if we had not had the chance to hear from ministers. I call on my colleagues, and this is a public meeting, a call on the people of Quebec to recognize the fact that we are being muzzled. People must be aware of the fact that Quebec is a minority society. And now we're being denied the chance to speak on behalf of Quebec. We're being hemmed in with increasingly restrictive limits. I really don't understand why it's so important to limit debate. Unless, perhaps, the government wants to prevent people from understanding what the Official Languages Act truly is. I call on the people of Quebec to watch what is happening. I call on the media as well to report on it. The Official Languages Act is the main driver of Anglicization in Quebec. It will lead to massive assimilation of Francophones. The government is not showing political will. You can see it in the act. You could see it in their daily actions. I hope we will be able to guarantee a certain level of speaking time. I hope we will have a chance to debate and express ourselves. Mr. Dalton, over to you. Thank you. I've noticed that we're almost out of time. So I'll yield the floor to Joël. As we noted earlier, were you referring to technical difficulties or? No, here I was actually going to suggest that it might not be necessary. Well, the floor is yours. Again, we are witnessing that the Liberals are not acting in good faith. You need to stick to the sub-amendment, Mr. Godin. I'm getting there. We are talking about Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment. She showed a certain openness, a certain willingness to find solutions. And unfortunately, the Liberals decided to deny unanimous consent. That wasn't a good faith move. It looks like they don't have the same goal as the other three parties. It looks like the NDP is moving more towards the opposition parties. I appreciate it, so thank you, Ms. Ashton. Along that same vein, I also want to break up this logjam. Since November 1st, you know how much time we've spent on this? We've spent 6 entire meetings. These meetings have been wasted to debate how to deal with C-13. So here's what I suggest. Next time, at our next meeting, instead of a full committee meeting, we should have a subcommittee meeting where the 4 parties come together. I suggest that we try to find a way forward that doesn't get us bogged down in procedure. That's my suggestion. I would like to hear what our colleagues have to say, and of course, since you're the chair of the subcommittee, I'd like to hear from you. Mr. Godin, I understand we can certainly make that happen, but right now we are debating a sub-amendment. Right now, we are debating the sub-amendment, and that's what the procedure requires. I understand that. We can talk about the sub-amendment, and then my suggestion is still on the table. Okay, anyone else on the sub-amendment? Chair. Yes, Mr. Saray. Yes, I will talk about the sub-amendment. What Mr. Godin has suggested is unacceptable. It undermines our credibility. What we need to do is finish up with C-13. We have seen amendments. We have accepted a number of them. I have accepted a number of Mr. Godin's suggestion. But the Bloc and the Conservatives have completely filibustered this meeting. So I say we vote. I'm sure Francophones would deeply appreciate it. Okay. Anyone else on Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment? I'm also looking at the screen. Oh, Mr. Beaulieu, over to you. Thank you for allowing me to take the floor. Here's what I think is unacceptable. Mr. Beaulieu, I will get back to you, but again, we are out of time. Do we have unanimous consent from committee members to adjourn as though there were technical difficulties? This would let us have a new meeting on Tuesday where we pick up where we left off. I have unanimous consent? I'll give him the floor later, but we just have a few minutes. Before getting into unanimous consent, I believe that Mr. Drouin wanted to add something. I just want to make sure that we are adjourning, but it's not a technical adjournment. I just want to make sure everyone is on the same page. Exactly. Room changes make it difficult to carry on one meeting that spans multiple days. So do I have unanimous consent? It's not that I don't understand. It's that I want to make sure parliamentarians' rights are respected.
So let me repeat myself so everyone understands. We'll be adjourning today on the basis of technical issues, but next meeting we'll pick up where we left off as if we had suspended. Do we have unanimous consent? Everyone's nodding. Yes, we have a couple of minutes left up our sleeve. Do we have unanimous consent to continue for 2 minutes more? Inaudible? It's 1 p.m. on the dot. We're going to adjourn. Adjourned.
Merci.